to give the audience a few moments to tune in, and then we'll jump into today's conversation. How are you doing today, Frank and Mike?
Wonderful. Thanks,
Doing well
Allison.
today. Thank you.
Great. And I see that the attendees are rolling in, so I'm going to get started.
Great.
To our audience, thank you for joining us today. Housing Wire is hosting a lunch and learn that is navigating the appraisal and whether the appraisal industry is going to take advantage of this current time and look at some modernization efforts. Today, we are joined by Frank Guarnera from Accurate Group and Mike McClintock from M&T Bank. Frank, Mike, I'd love for you both to introduce yourselves to the audience.
My name is Frank Guarnera. Work for the Accurate Group. I'm the National Director of Sales for the Accurate Group and have been in the industry, I'm dating myself, over 20 years.
Thanks, Frank. And I'm Mike McClintock. I'm the Director of Consumer Credit Operations for M&T Bank. I've been in the consumer lending role for about 20 years now, and my role consists of anything on the consumer side with the exception of mortgage, but we do offer home equity lines of credit within my world. So we do real estate secured within consumer, and it's one of the reasons why I'm here.
Now, today we're going to be talking about appraisal modernization, and across the housing industry, we've seen many changes and a rapid pace of innovation since early 2020. During the pandemic, the FHFA began allowing desktop appraisals. And in October of 2021, the acting director, Sandra Thompson, announced at MBA that Fannie and Freddie Mac would begin permanently accepting desktop appraisals for conventional loans. Now, this is something that's been talked about a lot all over the industry, and it's something that Housing Wire has talked about extensively. And most recently, there was a Fannie Mae study that was published talking about how lenders view appraisal modernization. And the results of that study showed that 94% of lenders believe that appraisal modernization efforts are valuable and that shortening loan origination cycle time was an overwhelmingly cited most important benefit. Now, I want to start with a question that sort of sets the stage for the rest of the conversation that we're going to be having today. And I want to get both of our panelists' perspective on how the unexpected volume that the entire industry saw in the pandemic highlighted the need for modernization and innovation across the industry. How did the appraisal industry specifically handle the high loan origination volume and all of the restrictions that we saw in 2021? Frank, let's start with you.
I thought the industry as a whole did an amazing job handling the record order volume as a result of COVID and really did an exceptional job kind of adapting to the challenges of COVID. If you look at some of the changes that took place, the GSEs introduced desktop appraisals during COVID to provide consumers and appraisers kind of a safe and contact-free appraisal alternative. The appraisers did a phenomenal job adapting to desktops, but also provide consumers and lenders at the same time with kind of high quality appraisals that everybody's accustomed to getting. In the home equity space, we saw the industry kind of pivot a little bit or leverage technology by introducing remote data collection on subject properties to continue producing hybrid appraisals. And then I think, finally, if you look at the industry as a whole, I think the GSE's use of appraisal waivers in conjunction with desktops, in conjunction with the appraisers' adoption of these changes played an integral role of really just keeping the industry from completely seizing up. So as an industry, I think we all came together, rose to the challenge, and really handled the volume as best as I think anybody thought we could.
Yeah, so I'll piggyback off of what Frank said. You know, we saw a tremendous amount of, well, we saw that the impact of appraisal volume going through the roof was the slowing of our appraisal requests, and it was impeding our turn time. It was you know, deteriorating our customer experience, right? It was taking us much longer to close requests because we had to wait for internal inspections. And when you have those COVID restrictions in place, those delays became onerous for us. So we took a step back. We have always used, we've for 20 years now have used AVMs, and we've used desktop appraisals to help support our HELOC business line. And we've always taken kind of a conservative approach when we use those electronic appraisals. And we recognize the fact that, hey, this conservative approach may be hurting us. Can we lever the electronics more heavily to help improve customer experience, help to get you know, our pipeline turned around and reduce the need for human interaction and human you know, formal internal inspections. So that was one of the steps we took and we embraced. We recognized that need, that pipeline was not gonna shrink as we continue to ask for internal inspections. So we took a deep look at our policies and procedures and embraced more electronics to help us improve our turn times.
So Frank just mentioned how it was one of the impressive things coming out of the pandemic was how the industry rose to the occasion to handle the volume. And I think it's also something that we've seen where when there were problems regarding turn time, there were sticky points, right, for across the industry. So looking retrospectively at all of the things that changed, what do you think are some of the problems that you've experienced now that highlighted the need for modernization during that time of high volume? Frank, let's start with you.
So, you know, Allison, the way I look at it as really, you can boil it down into 4 kind of overreaching problems that highlighted the need for modernization. The first was appraiser capacity, right? I mean, there is a finite number of appraisers. You can't scale that workforce because they're highly skilled. There are, you know, barriers to entry in the form of license requirements. So you just can't add appraisers overnight. So that high volume really showed just how dire the appraiser shortage is. I think the second point, and Mike just mentioned it, was extended turn times. You know, there were and there still are areas of the country where appraisal turn times are 5+ weeks. That's, you know, not a good functioning marketplace when it takes that long to get an appraisal. The other area, and again, Mike just made mention of it, was this all resulted in, let's say, a less than ideal borrower experience. And borrower frustration was magnified for purchase transactions because those transactions have defined close dates, right? So long turn times really put everybody on edge. And then I think the final area really was affordability, right? We saw in our business significant increases in appraisal fees throughout the country, which ultimately get passed down to the consumer. And unfortunately, rising fees often have kind of the greatest impact on those at the lower end of the income spectrum. And those individuals are least likely to be able to afford those increases. So, you know, these areas, in my opinion, were really the 4 key areas that highlighted the need for appraisal modernization. And I think that really just, you know, kind of came out of COVID. And that's really how I view it.
Yeah, and from a lender perspective, we talk to our partners, that help us with appraisals and titles, our appraisal management companies, and it's been clear that there's an appraiser shortage, right? Professionals in the industry. So this is a gap that's not going away anytime soon. I know the appraisal management companies and companies like Accurate Group have been lobbying to reduce the restrictions. I'm sure Frank can talk much more eloquently about that, but we recognize that problem, and we recognize that, hey, we have to find other solutions here. We're going to continue to have demand for this product. What kind of solutions are in the marketplace? And electronics were the way to go. And we didn't go into this lightly, right? We're regulated, and we have to prove to the regulators that these models are accurate, and that that the valuations that are being provided are of high quality, and that they back this type of electronic valuation method. So we have to continually prove that, and we do so. But we recognize that there's a need, and that need's not going away. So we truly understand that modernization of the appraisal process is critical, right? Appraisers are that appraisal pool continues to shrink, and we recognize that.
So, Frank, I just want to build off of what Mike just said.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways that you think modernization can help with that, can address that shrinking pool?
So it's interesting. I'm sure a lot of the folks that joined us today may have seen, Dan Wiley from Freddie Mac published an article in 2021, I think it was June of 2021, and highlighting the appraiser shortage, right? One of the interesting things in that article was that they found that there were the number of unique appraiser licenses submitting appraisals through UCDP remained consistent at roughly 40,000 unique appraiser licenses from 2013 to 2021. So that pool really didn't grow. You look at the average age of the appraiser, right? Average age, mid-60s. In 5 short years, that average age is what, early 70s? We may start to see that shrinking pool start to accelerate as you get further down the road. I think appraiser modernization really can have an immediate impact on appraiser capacity. So for example, in our desktop business, where we bifurcate the appraisal process, meaning we use trained data collectors to visit the subject property, collect the subject property data, there's a 4-to-1 increase in appraiser productivity, meaning appraisers can complete 4 desktops for every 1 appraisal completed using the traditional process where the appraiser does everything start to finish, right? So efficiency gains with appraiser modernization or hybrid appraisals will probably yield similar results in appraiser capacity, because the appraiser is not spending countless hours in the field, which is probably not their highest and best use of their time. With desktops, hybrid appraisals, appraisers can spend their time kind of analyzing and interpreting data, which is probably the most important, valuable service that they do for us. And possibly we may start to see an increase in appraisers maybe working later into their career, because they can complete assignments at their desk without having to leave, right? So I think all of that really is a positive for appraiser modernization. It's that increase in capacity and potentially maybe extending the life or career of appraisers.
So one of the things that you've mentioned a couple of times and Mike has mentioned is the GSE acceptance of desktop appraisals. And it was an exciting announcement at MBA. And since then, there's been a little bit of conversation if it's exciting, if there's some apprehension over those acceptances. But how do you think they fit into this conversation of modernization? Are they a radical step, or is it a necessary step as far as evolving the appraisal industry?
Mike, you want to take this one?
Sure.
I'll backfill you. How's that?
Absolutely. So I'll say absolutely necessary, right? GSE acceptance was critical to moving the needle on this front, right? Our HELOC book is portfolioed, right? So we're comfortable with that risk. But if the GSE is not going to back it, the primary mortgage volume is going to require the traditional appraisal methods, and nothing's going to change. So yeah, I found it to be absolutely necessary. We've, as I mentioned, we've levered on the HELOC side alternative appraisal methods, AVMs, desktop appraisals, for 20 years. So we're super comfortable with the risk. We're comfortable that we can talk to our regulators comfortably, showing them the models that we're using, and that we validate the process on an annual basis. And our regulators have been very comfortable with us. So that next step of our mortgage team accepting that process, we really needed the GSEs to step up to allow this. So it's allowing us to take that next step on the mortgage side as well.
I completely agree with Mike. I think one of the things that the GSEs are telling us, maybe not in so many words, is that during COVID, they accepted desktops. By them making it policy, I think they're telling us that they didn't see any deterioration in the quality of appraisals received during COVID compared to what the traditional process was. So quality held up. I also think another key message is that this binary approach, if you will, to appraising really no longer fits the needs of the industry, right? Meaning it's not an all or nothing proposition here. It can't just be a 1004 or nothing, right? There needs to be possibly a valuation cascade, if you will, right? And, it is change. I think change is difficult for everybody, but I think it's a necessity if we're going to really address the appraiser shortage, the capacity constraints, if we're going to continue to make lending affordable for everybody. So modernization is a necessity, but it's probably a marathon, not a sprint, right? And these changes are going to take place, but probably not overnight, but slowly roll them out. And I think what the GSEs are doing by introducing desktops as the first step is really smart.
And just to piggyback off of that, what would you say you think is the biggest hurdle for people regarding desktop appraisals? What do you think people think is the sticky point, and what would your comment to them be to address that?
I'll go first, Mike, but what I've seen probably the most, the biggest reservation is just, or hurdle is just acceptance, right? Acceptance from the industry, the regulators, the lenders, acceptance from the appraiser community. It's change, right? And with change, you've got to do this methodically. You've got to have this well thought out. But I think everybody needs to come together and look at the benefits. Using a risk-based valuation cascade, I think, is a far better approach to meet the needs of the industry, leveraging technology to collect data by a variety of sources, both public record and using trained data collectors will not only improve the process, but, significantly improve the consumer experience. And it will, at the end of the day, help us manage these spikes in volume and help us with the appraiser shortage and capacity issues. But again, it's really just going to be overall buy-in and acceptance from the industry.
Yeah, so we struggled with this question, when we first started allowing for electronics, right? So as Frank mentioned, change, it's tough to swallow, right? How are you really how am I explaining to senior management that, hey, look, we're not going to have an individual look at this property. We don't need it, right? We have other aspects of the loan that make it super high quality, and the valuation is a piece of it. So we were allowed to pilot it, right? And it goes to what Frank is saying, talking about, kind of a cascade. We allowed for a cascade initially to allow for very few electronics till we got comfortable, right? And we started to prove that, hey, look, this is a great alternative solution. So you had the cascade. If the loan was firing on all cylinders and we were able to use an AVM, we would use an AVM, and then it would cascade from there if the AVM failed to desktop and then to a formal appraisal. As we got comfortable, and over time, we could really show the performance, right? So it allowed us to move the needle and to the point where we are today, and extremely comfortable with the electronics versions.
So Frank, I want to ask you, Accurate Group, you mentioned, has been doing this for 20 years. This isn't as groundbreaking, I guess, as some people might think it is. What do you think you would say is your experience with how appraisers view desktop appraisals that you've implemented so far? Do you think it's been a positive experience?
I would say it's overall has been a positive experience, right? I think the key is communication with the appraisers and the appraiser community. So, as you said, we've been doing desktop appraisals in home equity and in servicing for 20 years, right? And to Mike's point, it takes time to get comfortable with that stuff. So, 20 years ago, right, we started educating our appraiser panels, and we continue to educate and communicate with appraisers to show them not only the benefits of the bifurcated process, but that the data that we're sending them through that third-party data collector is just as good as they could get when they go to the property themselves, because we're using technology, right? I mean, if you think about some of the technology, I mean, you could take your phone and do a 3D scan of an entire room, right? You can really leverage technology and provide so much data. And that's, again, that's having that conversation and working with appraisers to get them comfortable with that approach. And again, as we said, it's change, right? Not everybody is comfortable with change, but over time, I think that starts to, people start to accept it.
Now, you just mentioned that education process, and I think this is a really good moment to get your take and then Mike's take on, do you think once people are used to that technology process, do you think that's a good opportunity to get some fresh infusion of blood into the industry? Do you think that having that adoption in appraisals will incentivize more people to start that path to become appraisers?
I believe so. I know that, the Appraisal Institute, the GSEs are driving an appraisal diversity initiative to really create and attract the next generation of appraiser. Fannie Mae and MBA are driving an initiative called Future Housing Leaders, which is committed to training and finding, again, that next generation. Technology is definitely going to play a role. It plays a role in every industry. It's not just isolated to lending or appraisal. So I certainly think that the technology and the education is going to play a significant role. And again, just look at what happened in COVID, right? You had what do they call it? The great resignation, or people want to work from home, right? I don't think appraisal is any different, right? The next generation of appraiser may really gravitate to, you know what, I'd rather just sit at my desk and analyze data, right? So that next generation, maybe this is probably something they would gravitate to, at least in my opinion.
I definitely think it's been something that's been interesting to see in COVID. I know, Mike, you and I were talking about this earlier, how it's really sort of been different, right? And it's a different sort of experience now, having the opportunity, or how fast some people made those changes. I know, Mike, you mentioned how much of a struggle it was, or how quickly even you were able to switch to paperless, right?
Yeah. It's interesting when your hand is forced, Allison, you come up with some creative ways, right? When we were forced to have 100% work from home and we were paper reliant, we had to figure out how to go paperless pretty quickly. And we were able to be successful with that and change almost overnight, that was amazing to me, that we were able to really, embrace that more electronic version of ourselves and still stay organized and still be successful.
Now, to me, there's been a lot of excitement, and I think especially as we have more millennials and Gen Z coming into the housing industry and needing housing and looking at buying their first home, that there's been some big steps made in the digital process, especially since COVID. And it's brought a new aspect into the conversation where everyone's really talking about the customer experience. And that's suddenly one of those really hot topics that is seemingly inescapable now. So I'd be interested to see, Mike, what you think, and then going over to Frank about how there are ways to improve the experience with appraisals, and if there is an improved experience, does that extend to lenders?
Sure. So is the question more towards the customer experience or the bank's experience with appraisal management?
I would start with the customer's experience, but I'd also be interested to hear if that improves things for the bank.
Sure. Appraisals stand out, because it's so personal to a customer, right? That valuation of their property happens to be a very personal, kind of response. And when we're levering different approaches, sometimes the appraisal will just come back to us and work. So let's say it's an ABM or a desktop, and that valuation might be lower than the customer expected. We're able to, improve that customer experience by getting back to them much quicker, able to close that loan, and that makes the customer happy, makes our experience better. From a bank perspective, makes that gives us the ability to be more efficient, et cetera. So the other side of that equation is if we really see the internal inspections, we will see issues pop up with coordinating appointments, with delays with the obtaining an appraiser to go out to the property to actually conduct the inspection, fees that we absorb, right? The bank on the HELOC side, but increased fees, interactions with the actual appraiser at the properties. We receive, complaints on that end. So anything we can do to kind of make the process easier for the customer, that's what we're trying to look for. And if we can avoid that interaction and those requirements for appointments, and avoid those delays, and get away from those fee increases, that's something that we truly embrace.
I would completely agree with Mike there. I think, you know, if we can, through appraiser modernization, improve the consumer experience, right? And if you look at the consumer experience, and Mike hit the nail on the head, right? That appraisal is so personal. The value of their home is very personal. You know, if we can improve the process where we reduce the delays, where we, you know, keep those fee increases from, you know, getting out of control, reducing turn times, all that good stuff. That provides a good experience to the consumer. Inherently, that provides a better experience for the internal stakeholders within the, you know, the lending, our lending partners. And it's just a better experience overall. So again, there's a lot of discussion about appraisal as being the long pole in the tent, and it is because it does take right now, you know, in a lot of areas of the country, you know, weeks, upwards of 5 weeks. So improving that process, I think, is always going to be a good thing for the industry.
So you both just mentioned fees a couple times, delays in process. So you're really talking about when there are problems and increase in the amount of time spent on the origination process, but also fees that have the potential to trickle down to the consumer. So Frank, do you think that as technology becomes more adopted and as we see efforts for modernization take foothold, do you think that there's an opportunity that this also addresses the affordability concern that we're seeing all over the industry right now?
I think it may help, right? You know, at the end of the day, right, and I think the important thing is, as it relates to fees and appraiser fees, right? You know, and I know for certain Mike will agree, you know, we've got to pay the appraiser a fair fee, a reasonable fee for the work that they're doing, because it's extremely important work that the appraiser is doing, right? I think with appraiser modernization, it may help us from getting those huge swings, these increases, you know, double, triple the cost of what it normally might cost to do an appraisal. So that inherently will have an impact on just affordability. At the end of the day, there are going to be, without a doubt, fee increases due to complexity, and those are certainly justified. And I don't think those are going to go away, right? But appraiser modernization will help us kind of keep appraisal fees from hitting that kind of runaway inflation that we're seeing now with some of our other goods and services.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback that, you know, as that pool kind of shrinks by allowing for electronics, right? It allows the appraisers to really use their subject matter expertise on the more complicated properties that they really have to inspect, that we would really rely on their expertise for. So it gets them away from just the churn of the easy ones that can be handled electronically, and allows them to focus on the really complicated ones.
And I would think that there'd be some ease of access eventually once there's an education process for the appraisers, and timelines would be also helped and maybe accelerated. What do you think, Frank?
I think there's a lot of education right now going on throughout the industry, not just with appraisers, but with lenders. I mean, if we look at the GSEs right now are doing, you know, conducting pilots, a test and learn pilot, where they're working with some lenders to do that hybrid appraisal process, right? And appraisers are part of that process and part of the test and learn. So the education is there. I know there's a number of different conferences where this is a main topic. And again, it's continuing the communication with all stakeholders throughout the industry, from lenders to appraisers to regulators to educators, is key with any type of change. I'm optimistic that this is, change is definitely, it's occurring, and it's occurring the right way, right? It's like I said before, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
It's something that we see a lot of interest in at Housing Wire. There's, like you said, across the industry, there's a lot of educational efforts that are going on, especially into HELOC programs, non-QM, and products that are now seeing more popularity. Do you find that, Mike? Do you find that there's a lot more interest in educational efforts across the typical purchase origination?
I've had conversations with Frank. I think the education is available. It's as I look at, or hear from our partners in the industry and groups like Accurate Group, the struggle on the regulatory side and having to jump through so many hoops has me worried. I'm sure it has Frank worried about ensuring that we continue to have that subject matter expertise from an appraisal perspective, and getting new appraisers into the pool is a challenge, right? It's a major challenge, and it's not just about education. It's about licensing and allowing appraisers to move forward and be paid reasonably and fairly. So I think that's the bigger problem, or the bigger issue at hand.
Mike, I completely agree. I think, and I believe there are some changes taking place, but really leveraging technology and how we train the next generation of appraisers is going to be key to bringing more appraisers into the industry. It's definitely a lucrative industry. I can certainly envision educators and the industry working with universities to promote appraisal as a career path for college students. So I think that's really important, and I'm starting to see that play out, which is really important. It's a great career path, but we've got to do a little bit more in terms of the process and how we educate the next generation to become licensed appraisers.
Let's talk about that a little more. We spoke about this in calls earlier, and I want to talk about what the current, how, do you think it's easy to become an appraiser right now, Frank?
No, it's not. It's not because one of the requirements is an apprenticeship, and apprenticeships are hard to find. They're harder to find when appraisal volumes go through the roof, because if you think about the apprenticeship needs to be guided by an appraiser. Well, when the appraiser doesn't have enough time in the day to do their own work, they clearly don't have additional time to mentor an apprentice, right? So that creates a challenge, right? And my personal opinion is we can leverage technology and use video learning to maybe facilitate that apprenticeship, where maybe an educator has thousands of home inspections that students could walk through virtually with the assistance of an educator to kind of maybe help them through that. So maybe changes in how we help apprentices fulfill that requirement would certainly benefit the industry as a whole. to be able to get the next generation into the field, because that is a challenge, right? And that apprenticeship can be a major hurdle and stumbling block to growing the appraiser population.
It's interesting that you mentioned the video potential. I'm envisioning the same way that police teams now are training new recruits, where they have them go through video simulations and address different things. It's definitely been something that that has been new, and I think there's a lot of potential that we'll see across the industry in getting new people in the door. One thing that I want to make sure that we talk about briefly, Frank, is we've talked about how there's some opportunity here for modernization, and considering those points, do you think that there is an opportunity also with modernization to address some of the concerns that have been raised about fair housing and minority home ownership?
Are you referring to maybe the bias issue? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think that there's a part of it, but I also think access has been something that's been discussed a lot.
Access in terms of, I guess minority home ownership and that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think it all plays a role in that fair housing and minority home ownership. Again, at the end of the day, we need the market participants. We need the appraiser capacity to be able to, to process these loans, to make it affordable. And again, we talk about affordability. That plays a key role in home ownership, right? Not everybody's going to be able to jump in at the 400,000+ mark on a home, right? The affordability needs to be there, and appraiser involvement definitely plays a role, and having appraiser capacity in the industry is certainly going to play a role.
Yeah, I think there was something, I think earlier the point was raised where having the opportunity to just look at data and let the data speak for itself, I think sort of addresses this concern without making it overly complicated in one way, right?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in there. Yeah, sure. So we struggle with this one a little bit too. We worry about human bias, right, with appraisals, and certainly when we saw the downturn, we had some issues with just the actual internal inspections that were affected by human bias. The electronics don't have that human bias, but that said, we have to be very, very careful on how the models work, and how the models might work in a low to moderate zip code. And is it bias against that? And do you need more of a formal internal inspection in certain scenarios because properties might be unique in those areas? So it's a tough one. It's a tough one to say that modernization is going to solve this problem perfectly.
I would agree. I think the only other thing I would add, to modernization is, introducing kind of a neutral third party to the gathering of data for the subject property, and then sending that raw data to the appraiser that's solely working from their desk to kind of, analyze and develop a report. That inherently minimizes the potential for bias, because it creates more of an arm's length process between the appraiser and the homeowner. I don't have a magic answer that would completely eliminate bias, but it's certainly, appraiser modernization could certainly help minimize it.
I don't think anyone's looking for a cure-all, right? I think progress has to be recognized for progress. And I think that's something that's been really interesting when looking at the appraisal process in total. I know just before we got on this call, Frank, you said the last time you saw big modernization was a long time ago.
It was the late 90s when we introduced digital photos and electronic signatures, right? We went from glue sticking photos to a piece of paper to digital photos. That was revolutionary.
So when you consider how fast progress has been made in the past couple of years, I think it's important to look at that and recognize it as there's been some serious adoption here, and there's a lot of new things that are out there that the workforce is having to look at. And with that, I want to briefly touch on, as we rapidly get close to the end of this hour, why do you both think now is a good time for modernization? I know when I was thinking about this conversation specifically, we at Housing Wire had just published a story talking about where rates are and how the volume has decreased. So with the volume in April having dropped, like I think 10.6%, is now a good time for modernization efforts. Do you think that now is the time to say yes? Frank, let's start with you.
I think the time to say yes was a while back. There's no better time than the present, really, right? We've got to do something. We can't wait for the next spike in volume. I think what COVID has showed us, what the recent spike in volume has showed us, is that we've been slow to act, and we really, for the sake of the entire industry and all the participants, we really need to continue with the process of appraisal modernization. And I think there's a lot of great conversation there. There's test and learn going on with the GSEs. I just think that the time is right, and we really should just embrace it. And if we work together as an industry with the lenders, the regulators, the appraisers, the educators, I think I'm very confident we can achieve it. So we can't afford to sit around on our hands. I think we really should continue moving this forward. I don't know, Mike, what your thoughts are.
Yeah. So first off, from a volume perspective, we've seen HELOC volume demand shoot through the roof, right? So while the refi business is kind of dried up, we're certainly not seeing a slowdown in volume. We've seen a significant increase. But yeah, I would agree. You got to continue to innovate. You have to. And I think the GSE's acceptance to desktop is really going to light a fire under the mortgage industries, but certainly from a lending perspective, like what can they do to help make them more efficient? What can they, it's not, mortgage is not an efficient business from a lending perspective, right? It is a very time consuming process. And anything they can do to be more innovative should be welcome. And if volume is lighter now, then, and they have an opportunity to really try to, lever the excess resource that they have to improve and innovate, then, go for it. I think you will start to see acceptance, certainly, of desktops and electronic appraisals or alternative appraisals with the GSE's backing, right? And that was critical. So, and you heard the news today, Allison, that you shared with us. So that's good news, and I think the needle will start to move at a quicker rate.
Yeah, 94% of lenders are here for it, and the interesting thing to me was the second benefit that was listed in that study was that the two immediate benefits that were listed after that were, first, increasing and enhancing appraiser capacity, which is something that we've spoken to on this call. And the next potential benefit is lowering cost. And I think that that's something that's important, or getting a handle on the costs. And I think the other nice thing that was mentioned earlier in this is also making sure that appraisers get paid. So there's a lot of really interesting benefits. And as we get to the end of the hour, Frank, Mike, I want to ask both of you for final thoughts.
Mike, go ahead. I'll let you start.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate the time today. I thought this was a great conversation. I love being able to share our story and hear kind of feedback from Frank and the professionals that are on the appraisal side and some of their struggles. From a lending perspective, we've got appraisals are one of our important aspects of lending, but we get tied up with a lot of the other stuff as well. So it's great to hear what's going on in the industry and what steps are being taken to innovate and to make the process better.
And Allison, I would just thank you for hosting this event. Mike, I appreciate you joining to be able to, the more we talk about appraiser modernization, I think the more we can continue to move the ball forward, right? And change is coming. It's long overdue. And I think we've got the support of all the market participants. So it's exciting. Like I said, the last time I saw a big change was about 20 years ago. So this is exciting.
It's long overdue. I think that's what you said. I think that's what you said in our prep call, Frank.
Yeah.
So Frank, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Today's Lunch and Learn was brought to us by Accurate Group. It's always exciting to be able to have these conversations and be able to have conversations that follow the news cycle. To anyone who missed any portion of today's conversation, the recording will be sent out to all registrants. And if you would like to share the recording, it will be hosted on Housing Wire's website in the Knowledge Center. Frank, Mike, thank you once again.